Hello, Social 30-1 students. We're going to have a quick video covering Chapter 8. Okay, once again, Chapter 8 doesn't have an assignment, not a worksheet or anything like that, but there are a few essential things you need to understand about Chapter 8. Essentially, the chapter deals with, now that we have gotten to modern liberalism, to quote a song that I knew as a kid, where do we go from here? Okay, what now? Do we continue to move towards collectivism, or do we react towards capitalism again? What do we do? All right, so without further ado, we're going to start with this lesson. All right, this is a timeline of the evolution of liberalism. You can have a look at this, ranging from feudal society. We learned about this in the 3A section. The Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution is what we learned about in 3B. The American and French Revolutions is what you learned about in 3A. In Chapter 4, we looked at the challenges, the people that reacted against classical liberalism. So you can look at that. Continuing on with the timeline, early 20th century prosperity, welfare capitalism. So when I think of that, I think of the 1920s with the boom and bust cycles. I think of even before that with welfare capitalism under Teddy Roosevelt and his square deal, etc. You have World War One, Roaring Twenties, Great Depression, the movement towards the welfare state, the challenges to liberalism, the back and forth between what you saw with Keynesian economics and Hayekian economics and Milton Friedman, post World War II, Reaganomics, Thatcherism. And we're going to be talking about this new conservative term today called neocons or neoconservatism. All right, so we'll be looking at that. All right, and then finally you have the modern liberal look, the welfare state that you see in the United States versus modern conservative. The conservatives under Reagan, Thatcher, fast forward a number of years later, Ralph Klein, Stephen Harper, Donald Trump. So you have all that. This clip here, if you turn on Capitalism, a Love Story, from the 69-minute mark until about 80-minute marks, it's going to talk about the economic crisis of 2008. I am not going to play it for you right now, but feel free to do that if you want to kind of deep dive a little bit more into a modern liberal perspective of what happened back in 2008. All right, I'm back. I had to go and get some water with some apple cider vinegar, and I'm ready to go. All right, so this is the progression of liberalism to modern liberalism. Now, where do we go from here? All right, so concept I want to talk about here just for a couple minutes is the difference between these type of freedoms. One's called a negative freedom, and then the other one is called a positive freedom. So I just want to go over this concept for a minute. The principles of classical liberalism revolve around the belief that individuals should be free to make choices. You should be free, be free. Okay. This freedom is commonly called a negative freedom or freedom from, since you're free from something. Okay. So classical liberalism, in a way, was now you have all this freedom to make your own decisions. Okay. No one's going to save you at the end of the day. You're just free. But the problem with that is that when you have freedoms, you can make either bad choices or you're not able to make certain choices. And so some bad things can happen to you. Okay. But you have the freedom. It's like living in the wilderness and in the woods. It's up to you. Okay. Um, no one's going to save you. But at the same time, no one's going to hurt you either. That's a negative freedom. Whereas a positive freedom is more aligned with modern liberalism. Okay, it can be thought as freedom to something. So how do you get freedom to do something? Sometimes the government, in its infinite power and wisdom, can intercede in your life to bring about more freedoms. That's what is called a positive freedom. So, whereas a negative freedom is they're saying, oh, you just do it on your own, do your own thing, you take care of yourself. And if you are successful, that's great. And if you're not successful, that's your own bloody fault too. Um, Progressives would use their own power to bring about more equality and bring success to you. Therefore, it's a positive freedom. All right. So, therefore, government intervention ensured an equality of opportunity. Time for apple cider vinegar drink. Modern liberals argue that you cannot be free if your basic needs are not met. That's like Maslow that you learned about in Social 20, hierarchy of needs. If you're not fed and clothed and sheltered and all that, then a lot of your other needs aren't going to be met. If you are oppressed from unfair labor practices or subject to discrimination, hence, government intervention is needed to prevent these things from occurring. So the government needs to step in to bring about those freedoms, hence the positive freedom. At the same time, they believe too much government intervention could lead to tyranny. That's control. Therefore, they call for protection of civil liberties, equal rights, and a transparent, because all governments are this, transparent. All right, looking at this diagram, you have the difference between a classical and modern liberal. Once again, I don't think I need to go over this. Just have a look at this. Maybe pause it for a second. But going down to the bottom, classical liberals allow for freedom of thought, belief, opinion, expression. You have freedom of the press. You have freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. Okay, whereas a modern liberal, and these are more positive freedoms, have freedom from want, freedom from oppression, freedom from religious persecution, freedom from discrimination. So, how you go about doing that is that you have to probably pass laws to prevent discrimination, prevent ways in which you are too needy. And so, you need social programming, you need the welfare state and stuff like that. All right, enough of that. Yeah, we can move on here. Why aren't we moving on? Come on. Oh, there we go. I don't know why it was like stuck 10 times. So, in review, classical liberalism believes in negative freedoms, freedom to do things on your own, freedom from control. Okay. But once again, it's kind of a sink or swim kind of analogy, whereas modern liberalism is about positive. We're going to bring about the power of the government to bring you more equality. All right. This is a pretty good video that describes this in a lot more detail. You can watch it once again on your own. I'll just leave it at that. Positive and negative liberty. Oh.
Hey there, students. In this lecture, I'm going to...
And so I am not going to show that to you. Come on. All right, we're going to turn to the next slide. All right. So once again, this is a diagram that describes the difference between, let's see if I can put myself back on there, the difference between classical liberalism and modern liberalism. We know what classical liberalism is at this point. Let's see if I can get this pointer working here. All right. So involves no government interference, propose that the sole function of government is to protect individuals' natural life, rights to life, liberty, and property, emphasizes economic liberalism, and promotes the freedom of the entrepreneur. By the way, Mrs. Price tells me I need to tell you all that I love you all and all that kind of stuff. I'm just not that warm and fuzzy, okay? But nonetheless, I do miss you guys. I do miss teaching a group of people. I do miss that interaction. That's why I'm a little bit nutty today. All right, so the effects of classical liberalism led to events like the Great Depression, the gap of wealth between the more developed nations and the lesser developed nations. okay, contributed to the development of counter ideologies such as communism. Eventually, we look at fascism in chapter 5, but we'll look at probably in about a week or two, which, like I said, eventually led to modern liberalism. Keynesian economics, demand side economics, the whole idea of equality of not only just opportunity, but perhaps equality of outcome. Okay, government programs, alphabet agencies, welfare state, all right, etc. So that's in a nutshell modern liberalism. All right, so what are some of these contemporary, modern challenges to liberalism? Where do we go from here? Is it all just going to be modern liberalism, or is there going to be a reaction to that? And we're going to be looking at 4 different challenges. And I won't go into a ton of detail on here, but in this chapter, which is chapter 8, we're going to look at ideologies or movements that challenge modern liberalism, but not necessarily destroy it. When we look into chapter 12, however, in the next unit, we're going to be actually looking at ideologies and movements that could actually destroy permanently liberalism because it destabilizes, for a lack of a better word. But these just challenge it. It just tells you, okay, we got to go a different direction. We got to evolve. We got to change. So how does it change? Well, let's just look at it. So questions to consider. 1, how much do we want or need the government to be involved in our lives? If we believe in modern liberalism, we want it to be involved quite a bit. If we're more classical liberal or modern conservative nature, we don't want them involved nearly as much. How much freedom are we willing to give up in exchange for security? Well, we're looking at present time. It seems like we'd be willing to give up quite a bit of our freedom for the sake of security. Why did classical liberalism evolve to modern liberalism? I hope looking into chapter 4 and into chapter 6, and now that we're into chapter 8, you should be able to answer that question. A lot of us wanted more security, and we were willing to give up some of our freedom for that security. Okay, we saw the inequities that had existed, and we wanted that gap to become narrower over time. How have new ideas contributed or challenged modern liberalism? Okay, so we're going to be looking at that here in this chapter. All right, so the first ideology that actually challenges modern liberalism is environmentalism. Environmentalism is, I guess you could call it an ideology. Some would call it a movement, but it is certainly an ideology that would challenge the whole idea of progression. Okay. It's basically saying this: we don't always have to progress technologically, monetarily, in order to have a more fulfilled quality of life. We need to find a better way. We need to find a way that's more perhaps sustainable. There's concern over environment versus the desire of consumption. Environmentalists are concerned about the rate of consumption. Okay, is it sustainable? They want governments to get involved and increase taxes on manufacturers, require manufacturers to collect their products from consumers when they are no longer useful, and encourage individuals to use less. So the whole thinking is this: if you use less, you're actually spending more. So in a way, it's going to hurt the bottom line economically. An example of what they're trying to do, in a contemporary sense, to try to curb people's usage of energy would be the carbon tax, an environmental tax on emissions of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a heat trapping greenhouse gas. The purpose of a carbon tax is to protect the environment by reducing emissions of carbon dioxide, helping to mitigate climate change. Once again, this is a very controversial issue, especially in our own home province of Alberta. It is affecting lives, it is affecting jobs, it is affecting careers, and all the service industries that are helped by those jobs too. All right, here's a great chart that kind of looks at these different ideologies that challenge liberalism. And each of these charts, they have an interpretation of the past, they have a vision of the future, they have belief about human nature, they have beliefs about the structure of society, they have level of support, and what is their impact on liberalism. So we're looking at themes and characteristics of ideologies. So, for example, with environmentalism, its interpretation of the past is that support for science led to unforeseeable problems. Its vision for the future is that it can accept progress as long as the impact on the environment is considered. So, is it sustainable? Is it something that's not going to destroy our environment? Beliefs about human nature is that they believe that we are responsible for caring for the environment and have an innate inability to do so, innate ability to do so. Structure of society is that all living things should be considered in the structure. The perspective of political voices such as environmental lobby groups and the Green Party embrace a structure that respects environmental issues and concerns. All right, and then level of support, impact on liberalism. All right, so that's the first group that challenges modern liberalism. Are we doing too much? Is there too much consumption? Can we cut back, etc.? The second ideology that challenges liberalism is a reaction against modern liberalism, and that is neoconservatism. It is a political philosophy, supports using American economic and military power to bring liberalism, democracy, and human rights to other countries. So, in a nutshell, it is this: neocons are conservatives economically, they're even conservatives politically and socially, but they also believe in intervention. They are interventionists, okay? They are willing to use the power of the nation state to bring about more intervention, more democracy, more liberalism to other places in the world. We're going to be learning about impositional liberalism when we get to chapter 9 and how successful or unsuccessful it's been. But neocons believe that they should use the power of the government, which is kind of a progressive measure, to bring about more Americanization, more liberalization throughout the world. So they believe in going to foreign countries and intervening, conquering dictatorships, establishing liberal governments. Okay. They're not afraid to use a lot of money to do that. So, one big difference between them and your traditional conservatives is fiscally, they're willing to go into debt financially in order to pay for some of these adventures. Okay, so Ronald Reagan was a neocon. George Bush and his son, George W. Bush, were both neocons. Okay, I wouldn't call Donald Trump as much of a neocon. Okay, but certainly many people within the Republican Party are neocons. Once again, videos that you could watch on what a neocon is. The first one's more of a funny video that deals with who neocons were. The second one is a longer, more serious video. It's from a right-wing libertarian perspective. So the group is called the John Burke Society, and they're fairly right-wing. I mean, and they're not fascist right-wing, but they're certainly very libertarian, very America first kind of perspective. Yes, come on. A famous neocon by the name of Irving Kristol once said, when two neocons meet, they're more likely to argue with one another than to confer or conspire. Whatever. That's just something witty that he would say at the time. It just means that there's a broad range of people that believe in this kind of interventionist conservative policy. All right. When we think of neocons, we also think of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher. Both believed in fiscal conservatism, but at the same time, they were both believers in international interventionism. Okay, George W. Bush is a neocon. His famous speech on the axis of evil is a quintessential speech on being a neocon. And this axis of evil speech came just following the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, etc. So here's a clip from this. And I'm afraid it might not work, so we'll see. All right, I think that's good for now. But that would be an example of a neocon foreign policy, interventionist uh, action in order to bring about more democracy, more liberalism. Now, another thing you might want to remember from that speech is that was one of the famous speeches that brought about this so-called Bush doctrine. So George W. Bush and his doctrine means that America has the right to intervene in the affairs of another nation if they perceive them to be a threat. And so traditionally, America has never attacked another nation unless they have been attacked first. But this gives them the justification because of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons to have a preemptive strike against a perceived or real threat. And so when the United States went into Iraq back in 2003, they perceived them to be a threat because of weapons of mass destruction. So, anyways, understand that. Neocons generally advocate a free market economy with minimum taxation and government economic regulation, strict limits on government provided social welfare programs, and a strong military supported by large defense budgets. Hence, that's why they're willing to go into debt. Neocons also believe that government policy should respect the importance of traditional institutions such as religion and family. Unlike most conservatives of earlier generations, neocons maintain that the United States should take an active role in world affairs, though they are generally suspicious of international institutions such as the UN and the World Court, whose authority could intrude upon American sovereignty or limit the country's freedom to act in its own national interests. All right, so I'm not going to read all this. This is just kind of review of things that they support. Couple things from this slide. Sometimes they're associated with the Christian right, but a lot of times the Christian right and some of these groups aren't your real neocons. They're more just your libertarian, uh, traditional type of conservative. Okay, the Tea Party certainly broke away from the neocons because they just think that the neocons are they spend too much. Okay, I think like Ron Paul and Rand Paul would be examples of your traditional conservatives. Okay, they would be against the neocons. All right, so in summation, neocons' interpretation of the past, um, the state of humanity never has been better. Policy went against many Americans' ideals of equality and their strong beliefs in the individuals. Détente reflects weak foreign policy. Have a look at the readings in your textbook. Their vision of the future, economically minimal government interference, but they believe in lots of intervention internationally. Okay, beliefs about human nature, etc. So that's the second of these ideologies that challenge modern liberalism. There are two other examples of groups that challenge liberalism. The third one would be religious perspectives, whether you got in Canada the Doukhobors and the Hutterites. Throughout the world, you have Islamic Sharia law. In the United States and Canada, you have Christian right. Okay, those groups challenge liberalism because their infrastructure doesn't have the same amount of liberalism and freedom within it than your typical modern liberal society. And of course, the fourth area in which can challenge modern liberalism would be Aboriginal collective thought. We are mainly individual in nature with some aspects of collectivism, whereas Aboriginal collective thought is predominantly collective in nature, okay, egalitarian in nature. Their decisions are based on not majority, but a consensus where people have to eventually just kind of compromise and come to an agreement on an issue. Very traditionally based, okay. An example of an Aboriginal collective thought in action would be the territorial government of Nunavut, where decisions are not based on a vote or anything like that, but based on consensus, a lack of political parties. Another consideration is this whole idea of Aboriginal collective justice, holistic justice, sentencing circles, community-based type decisions. Okay, that perhaps counter your traditional liberal way of doing things. And I'm not going into all this, but one of these groups that challenge modern liberalism would be the Doukhobors. You can certainly read about the Doukhobors in your textbook. Okay. Pause this if you want to read this, but I'm not going to go into too much detail about the Doukhobors. But certainly they would challenge Canadian law, Canadian standards, based on modern liberal or even classical liberal principles. Okay. Recent challenges to liberalism in Canada have been the request by religious groups to use religious laws to settle legal disputes. So, for example, in 2005, Ontario decided against the use of religious arbitration, regardless of the denomination. Right. This is a chart that describes the difference between the Christian right and modern liberals. You can pause this if you want to look at this a little bit more in detail. Okay. There you go. Religious perspectives, their interpretations, their visions of the future, and so on and so forth. You can, like I said, pause this and read this if you would like. And like I said, the fourth example of a group that challenges modern liberalism would be Aboriginal collective thought. Okay, the collective is ultimately more important than the individual, challenges European style government systems. Okay. Aboriginal collective thought is actually protected in our present Charter of Rights and Freedoms, specifically under sections 25 and 35 of the Charter. We learned about this in Social 9 back in Chapter 4. I know Social 9 was like a lifetime ago for you, but this would be an example of modern liberalism. An example of accommodation within our own Canadian society. Okay, once again, go ahead and pause me and read this if you like. And this all kind of boils down to collective rights that are protected in the Charter. We got specific land claims, we have comprehensive land claims. You might have remembered the Métis, for example, were not originally included in the numbered treaties, but they fall within the more modern treaties that the Canadian government made with the Métis people, specifically the Charter. Like I said, pause if you want to read this. This is a diagram that talks about, how the First Nations holistic model is played out as far as treating people that commit crimes. Okay, you have three basic areas. You have the victim, you have the offender, and then you have the community. And how do they all come together to come to some sort of consensus on how to deal with these issues? In the middle, you see, and let me just create the highlighter here. You have restorative justice, a holistic approach at justice. So, how do you bring all these groups together? Well, you have these stakeholders. Okay, victim is a stakeholder, the community itself is a stakeholder, the offender is a stakeholder. So we have to preach accountability. Okay, how is the victim accountable to the offender? Okay, we have community safety. How is the community safe from from the victim and the offender itself? And how do we develop competency? How do we develop programs that can appease the victim and help them become restored, and at the same time rehabilitate the offender? Still learning, people. So, summary: decisions are made using consensus instead of debating and voting. Consensus model: every individual voice must be heard. A central principle of modern liberalism is to share the benefits of development and to develop wisely, free of party politics. Okay, so what you get, for example, in our own country and the United States is not there. Movement towards health centers run by First Nations, regardless of the type of medicine used. A health system that is autonomous from the federal government. Autonomous means free from. Focus on preservation of the land, not misusing it. One of my favorite words of all time is holistic approaches to solving issues. Holistic meaning using different methods, not just the straight traditional method, but finding different ways to get something accomplished. All right, this is a summary piece. You can read this on your own. Okay, how does Aboriginal perspectives interpret the past, its vision for the future, etc. All right, to end off today, this is a video that deals with the neocon reaction against modern liberalism. And so I'll leave this for you today, and this will be the end of the Chapter 8 lesson.
What a roller coaster ride. We love liberalism. Let's have a capitalist society. Oh, we hate liberalism. Let's have a socialist society. No, wait. Let's try and have the best of both worlds.
All right, we're not going to show that. Like I said, you can look on YouTube to do that. I don't know why it's kind of messing up, but we're just going to leave it at that today. You can watch this video. You can go on the Google Slides presentation and kind of look that up. It's a pretty good review video of the neocon reaction to modern liberalism. All right, so without a further ado, I think that'll be it for this discussion for today. Okay, and I will see you when I see you. Bye now.